Independent Senator Rex Patrick joins us again on Flow. How are you going, Rex?
Yeah, really good. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
And what's the mood? What you're picking up out there in the electorate as you travel around South Australia?
Well, we're getting close to election day, and people are now having to focus their minds on who they're going to vote for. I've had some really good conversations with people. I sense that there's a mood for change. My message to everyone, of course, is that whether it's Labor or Liberal in the lower house, you need to have an independent South Australian looking after our state in the upper house. So I'm the insurance policy for SA.
Yeah, and to be clear, you're not one of the independents in the House of Representatives that would potentially decide who forms government. You're going to be hold whoever forms government, minority government or otherwise, to account.
That's correct. So my job in the Senate is to review, amend, pass or reject legislation that is tabled in the House by whoever does form government, and of course to watch over anything that the government of the day does, irrespective of whether it is Labor or Liberal or some form of coalition of a major party and some minor parties. That's what I've been doing for the last 4.5 years. I'm unencumbered by any party line, so I can take on pretty much any issue that's important. And for example, if there's an issue about the Murray-Darling, I can take an SA perspective, whereas someone from perhaps the Labor Party need to be mindful that they have voters in the eastern states, and if a South Australian senator goes too far out on a limb, they'll get pulled back pretty quickly.
Now, on that front, we'll start off on the Murray-Darling Basin then, and we cover multiple states in the basin, and what we're hearing from upstream, an interview I just did with an independent candidate in Mallee across the border, is that the 450 gigalitres under the plan can't be delivered. It's not that they don't want to, they just say it's just not possible. What's your perspective on this 450 gigalitres? How are we going to get it into South Australia?
Well, first, South Australians need to understand that we only signed up to the plan because of those 450 gigalitres, which are supposed to be targeted at the river mouth, the Coorong and the lower lakes. And so failure to deliver on those 450 gigalitres is a breach of promise to all South Australians. Now, one of the problems we've got is that there is no penalty in the plan if the 450 gigalitres doesn't get delivered. Right now, on the record, where the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder has water from the 450, only 2 gigalitres has been delivered in the last 9 years, and we've got sort of less than 2 years to go. I've been putting as much pressure as I can on the government. Unfortunately, you can have the Liberal government saying, we support the plan in full. You can have the Labor government saying, we support the plan in full. That doesn't mean they actually have a plan to implement. My view is if they fail to deliver under the plan, then the government should go upstream and find willing sellers and buy water that fulfills the 450 gigalitre promise.
Does it become incumbent on the federal government, if that can't be delivered, if they struggle with buyback, or if it's politically unpalatable for them, to help run the desalination plant more regularly in South Australia to help meet that amount of water?
Well, one of the things they did when we were in drought a year or so ago was they ran the Desal Plant in Adelaide, used that to pump water into Happy Valley Reservoir, so that they didn't have to take as much water out of the Murray, and that meant they could give some of that water to people producing fodder. Now, what they found was that was an extremely expensive way to do things. The cost of the reverse osmosis units that carry out the desal, the energy costs are very, very high. What needs to happen is you need to couple these desal plants with perhaps solar or wind energy, a much, much cheaper energy source, such that it becomes affordable. And sadly, I think what will happen with the desal plant is in Adelaide, it will simply remain as an emergency reserve in the event that Adelaide can't get drinking water.
Now, I'm going to do a beautiful segue here. We've seen in another topic of pork barrelling, $5.1 billion committed to a dam at Townsville by the coalition government. What does that tell you about, I guess, where the priorities lie for either of the major parties in a federal election versus South Australia? I mean, that's a big injection for water security for people in northern Queensland.
Well, South Australians need to understand that in relation to pork barrelling, only $221 million has been promised to all of the jurisdictions in South Australia, each of the electorates. The biggest one being Mayo, which has got $125 million that has been allocated throughout the election. That I compare that to other states where we see something like $3.8 billion across 10 seats, $380 million per seat. South Australians really are getting ripped off in terms of proper expenditure of public money in this pork barrelling. People should have no doubt in their mind that pork barrelling is corruption. It is the buying of votes by political parties using taxpayers' money. And what needs to happen is we need to absolutely understand that it is corruption, stop it from happening, and all public money ought to be spent on the basis of need, merit, and value for money. No exceptions. There needs to be proposals laid out right across the nation in accordance with an integrated plan that's about advancing Australia. And we make sure that if we need a Desal plant on the Eyre Peninsula, because that's going to give us fantastic growth throughout the Eyre Peninsula, that must take priority over, some swimming pools in the Northern Territory or some swimming pools in North Sydney. Each jurisdiction might claim that their wants and needs are more important, but we need to look at that objectively and work out what is the best return on the taxpayer spend. And that's not happening when people just wander around and throw taxpayers' money around for the purpose of getting re-elected. That is corruption.
And on that front, as you talk about the disparities between states, you've also been saying Australia's federation, if I've got this right, is broken or that it needs some reform. What are the reforms that you're talking about? Well,
people will remember that after the start of the pandemic, the Prime Minister abandoned COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, and formed up the National Cabinet. And look, I think it's fair to say that was an effective body initially as we tried to deal with an emergency, but over time we've seen that body fracture. There's more disagreement than there's agreement. There's a whole bunch of secrecy associated with that body because the Prime Minister is still of the view that it is a cabinet, even though there's been a judicial ruling that says it's not. Something has to replace that now defunct body. National Cabinet was supposed to meet every month. Its most recent meeting was in March. And again, I think we've sort of gone past the point of its usefulness, and we really do need to start thinking about how we move forward in a federation, getting the best possible cooperation across all of the states and the federal government to get the best outcome for all Australians. There are other issues that I have difficulty with. I don't think the Parliament's working well in terms of its ability to conduct oversight. There's lots of secrecy. We've seen even the Senate's Privilege Committee really being quite weak in response to governments not handing over documents. There's a whole bunch of reforms that need to take place. And I'm not saying I have all of the answers. I think what we need to do is examine the current arrangements, how effective they are, and what needs to change so we get better outcomes for Aussies.
Well, it seems to me one of the examples of where the Federation broke was where there were snap lockdowns and people rushing to cross borders and kids that couldn't get home to their parents because of rules and restrictions. Would that be part of an inquiry you're proposing to look at how the Federation has been functioning and how it needs reform?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm proposing, is a Senate inquiry to look at the way in which the Federation works or, as you point out, doesn't work, and whether or not there are better arrangements that can be put in place to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen in the future.
Well, we're out of time, Senator Rex Patrick, Independent Senator for South Australia, but we have appreciated catching up with you during the campaign, and we do wish you all the best on the 21st of May.
Good on you, Ricky, and thanks to your listeners.